Okay, welcome all. I shall make a start. I'll first say I think we've only got one apologies for absence, which is Terry Kiernan. Are there any more apologies?
No, we just had the one from Councillor Terry Kiernan, Chair.
Okay. Obviously, due to COVID-19 regulation, today's meeting is going to be held using the audio conferencing available to the public, available to us. Listen to the audio, and if you can if you can mute yourselves and put your hand up if you do want to ask any questions, if you would, please. Are there any declarations of interest? I don't believe any is. No? Okay, thank you for that. Hang on. Can we go through the minutes of the last meeting held on the 30th of July? Can I have a proposer and seconder for accepting those minutes?
Proposed.
Jackie? Nathan? Yeah.
Seconded.
You got that documented yet? Okay, thank you, everybody. And now we're due to receive a presentation from Anthea. Now, the presentation you haven't received, been received a bit. Hasn't been received or hasn't been put out. We agreed not to distribute it because we thought we'd go through it and leave it up for debate during this meeting. So that's why you haven't received it before this meeting. So I will hand over to you now, Anthea, if that's okay.
Thank you, Chair. I will share my slides in a moment, but just before I do, just confirm I will circulate them with the committee after the meeting so that you have the opportunity to look at them. And also there are some links to a couple of documents in there as well, just for further reading, should committee members wish. So, Chair, I'm just going to try and share my slides. I will in a minute ask you the usual, can you see that question? Can you see that?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So let me just. Hopefully that makes it a little bit easier for members to read as well, because I know it's not always easy on the screen. So, Chair, thank you. This is a presentation on the LGA's Model Code of Conduct. I just thought it would be useful because it's been some time since we met, just to go through or just repeat the history to how we've got to where we are. So members of the committee may remember that back in January 2019, the Committee for Standards in Public Life published a report on ethical standards in local government. That was quite a comprehensive report, and I do recall that shortly after it was published, the committee did spend some time going through the recommendations of that report. Essentially, the report was split into two different parts. The first part was changes that were required to be supported by legislative changes. And the second part was changes that could be made without the need for legislative changes. And one of those was to update the Code of Conduct and to seek all authorities to sign up to a model Code of Conduct. That took us forward to summer last year, and that was the meeting for the minutes that you've just approved. The Local Government Association was the organisation that decided to draft a model code of conduct for consideration, and members of this committee will remember that we had quite a constructive meeting in July where we went through the consultation responses or the consultation questions, should I say, and we created a response to that consultation, which then was taken into account along with, I believe, 3,000 other responses to the consultation. And then through late summer into the winter, the LGA was considering those consultation responses and held some consultation events as well. And that led to, in late December, the final version of the Model Code of Conduct being released. And it's that final version of the Model Code of Conduct that I want to move on to talk about this evening. I just thought it'd be useful to set out that we do have a code of conduct at the moment. Every authority is required to have one by law, and we do have one. And I've provided a link to it there. I don't intend, well, I will just click through to it if I can. I don't know if this will work on the screen. So please, this is a bit of a, no, it doesn't work. That's fine. Members should be fairly familiar with the Code of Conduct. It's one page and it's based upon the 7 principles of standards in public life, also known as the Nolan Principles. It was last updated in May 2015, and it takes an easy read approach. That's the best description. So it's one page detailing the 7 principles with some guidance points beneath each principle to set out what members should do. It doesn't provide any detailed guidance around how to deal with interest, although there is more information contained within the Constitution on that. And it's not really brought to life in any way. It's quite dry, although some would say that's always the case. It is adopted by most parish and town councils in the borough. The new code, I provided a link there as well, Chair, and I may just at the end of the presentation click through to the Code of Conduct and share it on the screen so members can see what it looks like. It's applied to, or the intention is that it should apply to all elected councillors and all co-opted members, as well as any directly elected mayor. I've just included that for completeness because members will know we don't have a directly elected mayor. To that extent, it's the same as our current Code of Conduct. Our current Code of Conduct applies to elected councillors and co-opted members as well. It is substantially more detailed than the current code. It's 17 pages long, and it is based upon the 7 principles. But what the LGA has done is they've used those 7 principles to create what they've described as general principles, and I've set them out there. And members may remember part of the discussion in July was around whether to use the first person or the third person in terms of presenting the way that the code was drafted. And this is what the LGA has gone for. So I presume that the majority of consultation responses were in favour of a very personal approach. And so the general principles are set out. There's 4 of them. I act with integrity and honesty. I act lawfully. I treat all persons fairly and with respect. And I lead by example and act in a way that secures public confidence in the role of councillor. So they are the general principles. It then goes on to set out what members should do when undertaking their role. Apologies for the slight typo there. And the next 5 bullet points are the what members should do. So I impartially exercise my responsibilities in the interests of the local community. I do not improperly seek to confer any advantage or disadvantage on any person. I avoid conflicts of interest. I exercise reasonable care and diligence, and I ensure that public resources are used prudently in accordance with my local authority's requirements and in the public interest. The new code applies when a councillor is acting in their position as councillor, and when actions of the councillor give the impression to a reasonable member of the public who knows all of the facts that they are acting as a councillor. So that does extend it slightly more than the current Code of Conduct and the current legislation. And I'll come back to that point later in the presentation. But essentially, what it means is certainly when you're acting in your position as councillor, you're subject to the Code of Conduct, and that is no different to now. But the second part of that sentence does extend the Code of Conduct to an extent into your private life or your personal life, to an extent. It applies to all forms of interactions and communications. The current code does too. However, it's not express, it's not explicit in the code. Like I said, it's one page and it's focused on the principles, but by inference, it applies to all forms of interactions and communications. The new code clearly stipulates that it applies to all of these different types of interactions. So face-to-face, online communications, telephone calls, written communication, and verbal interaction, non-verbal communication, so no gesturing, social media communication, social media posts, statements, and comments. Interestingly, the code also states that it sets out the minimum standards, so that there's an expectation that this is the absolute minimum that members should be complying with, but that members should be holding themselves to a higher standard. And then it contains guidance as to what each conduct rule requires as well. So what are those conduct rules? Well, I've summarised them here because, like I say, there's 17 pages. So I've tried to dilute it down into as little text as possible. The first one is respect, and that's a requirement that you treat other councillors and members of the public with respect. You're also required to treat employees of the local authority and employees and representatives of partner organisations and those people volunteering with respect, and also that you respect the role that they play. The second one is bullying, harassment and discrimination, and this does go further than the current code, and it's been included to specifically address issues around what is bullying, the fact that some people may feel that they're being respectful, but it might be perceived by the person who's receiving some behaviours that it's bullying or harassing or discriminatory. So it's been specifically provided for in the new code. So this requires members not to bully any person, not to harass any person, and also to promote equalities and not to discriminate unlawfully against anybody. Members might recall that there was quite a section in the Committee for Standards in Public Life's report on bullying, harassment and discrimination, and it seems that the consultation responses have supported the need to include it within codes of conduct. The third requirement is impartiality of officers. So members, you shouldn't compromise or attempt to compromise the impartiality of anyone who works for or on behalf of the local authority. Again, that's implicit in the current code, but it's not set out in such terms. Confidentiality and access to information. There is already legislative provision that means members are required to keep confidential information confidential and also to provide access to information where there's a legal right to do that. But it's not something that has made its way into the code of conduct here, and in fact in any other authority that I've worked in either. There hasn't been a particular provision within the code of conduct requiring compliance with confidentiality and access. So the requirements of this element of the code is that you don't disclose information given in confidence or disclose information that was acquired which you believe is of a confidential nature unless you have consent or required to share the information by law, or the disclosure that you make is made for the purpose of obtaining professional advice, or the disclosure is made in the public interest and you've consulted the monitoring officer before releasing it. You mustn't use any knowledge gained as a counsellor for the purpose of benefiting you, your family members, friends, employer or business interests, and you mustn't prevent anyone obtaining information that they are legally entitled to obtain. I think members will probably recognise that this reflects what you already do and how you already behave, but nonetheless it's now embodied in the Model Code of Conduct. Oh, I'm just having an issue moving the slides on. Yes, there. Okay. Has that moved on for you on the screen? Yes, I can see nods. So the fifth requirement relates to disrepute. Very simple. There's one line to this, and it's do not bring your role or the local authority into disrepute. The sixth one is the use of position. So you mustn't use or attempt to use your position as councillor to improperly advantage or disadvantage yourself or anybody else. You will see if we just go back, it's very similar to the second bullet point under the confidentiality and access to information point. So there is some overlap with some of these. The 7th requirement of the code is that you mustn't use resources or facilities. You mustn't misuse council resources, sorry. And if you do use council resources, you must act in accordance with the local authority's requirements and ensure that they're not used for political purposes. There is an exception to that, and that is where the use for political purposes is reasonably necessary for the discharge of functions of the council. The 8th requirement, it seems obvious, but again, it's not something that's ever been included in the code of conduct, and again, in my experience, not in any code of conduct that I've worked with or have been involved in, and that is that members must comply with the code of conduct. Again, it's implicit, but as part of that, you don't just have to comply with it. There's a requirement that you undertake training that's provided by the local authority, that you cooperate with any code of conduct investigation or determination, and that you don't intimidate or attempt to intimidate any person who's likely to be involved with the administration of any investigation or proceedings, and also that you comply with any sanction imposed following a finding that the code has been breached. What I would say about this section is it is implicit in everything that is currently contained in the code of conduct. It's challenging to enforce this without any more significant sanctions. Members, I'm sure, will recall many discussions around the sanctions that are available under the Localism Act when there has been a breach of the code of conduct, compared to the sanctions that used to be available under the old regime. And one of the recommendations of the Committee for Standards in Public Life is that the sanctions, there's legislative changes to introduce additional sanctions. At the moment, we have a bit of a circuitous situation where you might have an investigation into a member, they don't cooperate or they don't comply with any sanction, and all you can do with that is refer it as another complaint as a failure not to follow the code of conduct. And so there isn't potentially, and I'm saying this potentially, I've never experienced it, but potentially you could have a member who just doesn't comply and just continues to be investigated for a breach of the code of conduct without any outcome. I have to say, throughout all of this, some of the bullet points, I think there must be some authorities that have far more complaints and issues with member conduct than we have, and from my experience, from what we have experienced historically, because some of the bullet points would suggest that there's some issues that some people who are working within the standards regime feel need to be addressed, but largely speaking, they're not things that I recognise, either in this authority or any others that I've had the experience of working in. Interests, you must register and disclose interests. I have another slide on interest because there's a lot of information around that in the code of conduct. And then gifts and hospitality, not to accept gifts or hospitality of any value which could give rise to personal gain or suspicion of influence to show favour on anyone. The second bullet point is interesting. So you must register gifts with the monitoring officer if the estimated value is 50 plus within 28 days if you have an accepted date. Members might recall when we did our consultation response in July, there was discussion around the value of gifts. Our current code is £25 or more, and the decision of this committee when we did the consultation response was that we wanted to keep it at £25. So members, moving forward, I would just ask whether or not you want to adopt the £50, whether you want to keep it at the £25 as you'd indicated previously. And then there's a requirement to register any significant gifts, but significant gifts is not defined in the code or within legislation, with the monitoring officer that you have been offered but you have refused. So even when you haven't accepted them, you're still required to register them. I would suggest, members, if you did want to include that, it would make sense to keep that at the same value as the requirement to register a gift, just for ease of understanding and simplicity. So I said I would come on to interests. The proposal is in the new code of conduct that there will be 3 different types of interests that members need to be aware of. I think the more long-standing members of the council will be familiar with the with the principles of all of them. But the first is disclosable pecuniary interest, and members should be very familiar with this. A disclosable pecuniary interest relates to you and your partner, spouse, or a person you're living with as your husband or wife or civil partner. And this absolutely mirrors the legislation. It's what you're required to do right now. If you have a pecuniary interest, you're required to register that interest within 28 days of election or re-election, and within 28 days of becoming aware of any new interest. Again, there's no change to that. That's what you're required to do now. At a meeting, you need to disclose a pecuniary interest. You cannot discuss or vote on any matter, and you must leave the room. Again, no change. That's exactly as we have right now, and again, it mirrors the legislation. The code goes on to say that where you're a cabinet member and there is an interest, you cannot do anything other than you must notify the monitoring officer that there's an interest, and then you can arrange for somebody else to deal with the matter. This expands upon the guidance to the rules that we've currently got, but it isn't any different to the current requirements. Our cabinet members are required to notify of an interest, and then they're not able to participate in anything that they've got a pecuniary interest in. Again, that mirrors the legislation. The only difference here is that it's expressly stated in the Code of Conduct rather than it being implicit by virtue of the application of the rules. I've just included these for completeness. There's no change to what we currently have, and there's no change to the legislative requirements. So a pecuniary interest is anything that's in this table. So anything relating to your employment office, your trade, your professional vocation, and that includes any unpaid directorship. It includes any sponsorships, so any payments or provision of financial benefits that the council has had during the previous 12 months for expenses incurred by him or her carrying out their duties, or any financial payments towards election expenses. Contracts, this is any contract between the councillor or their spouse. I've just used spouse as a shorthand, but that's spouse, partner, anybody you're living with as if they're your spouse or partner. Or a firm in which the councillor or their spouse is a director in, or that they have a beneficial interest in. So the contract is a contract between them and the council to provide services and goods, and it hasn't yet been completed. So an open contract, an existing contract. Any land and property that's owned in the council area or that you have a tenancy of. Any license of property that you occupy in the council area for a month or longer. Any corporate tenancies, so where you or your spouse partner is a director or has a beneficial interest in a body. If that body is a tenant and the landlord is the council, then that is also a pecuniary interest. And then securities, which is the one that very few people ever need to declare, but where you have any interest in securities in a firm, in a body that is in the council area, and the value of that exceeds £25,000, or the share capital exceeds 1/100th of the shares. The second type of interest in the Model Code of Conduct are described as other registrable interests, and long-standing members might recall this because this was a standard reference under the old legislation, the old provisions, when you were dealing with interest. So other registrable interests, again, you need to disclose the interest, and that mirrors the legislation and mirrors what you have to do now. When it comes to speaking, the new Model Code of Conduct says that you can only speak on the matter if members of the public are also allowed to speak. But other than that, you cannot take part in any discussion or vote on the matter, and you must leave the room. This currently isn't in our Code of Conduct or our Constitution, and it's not a requirement of the legislation. And then there's other registrable interests. So it's slight difference. Sorry, no, forgive me, it's the next slide. This is what an other registrable interest is. So it's where the business of the local authority relates to or is likely to affect any body of which you're in control or management of, and to which you are nominated or appointed by your authority. and anybody exercising the functions of a public nature or directed to charitable purposes, or whose principal purpose includes the influence of public opinion or policy, and that includes political parties or trade unions. So these are other interests that you need to disclose. You do already disclose them under our current requirements, but the second bullet point there goes beyond what is required in law and what's currently required in our code. And then this is the third type of interest, a non-registrable interest. And this is described as a matter that directly relates to your financial interest or well-being, or that of a relative or close associate. Then you must disclose that interest. Again, you can only speak on a matter if members of the public are also allowed to speak. And again, you cannot take part in any discussion or vote. And again, you need to leave the vote. So members, you now have, the proposal is that you would now have three interests. You would have pecuniary interests, which you're all very familiar with. You would have other registrable interests, which you're very familiar with. And then you have non-registrable interests, which is this slide. The proposal with all three is that you cannot participate and you must leave the room. For the second two, so the registrable interests and non-registrable interests, you can speak if members of the public are allowed to speak. That's essentially what the new code of conduct says. So in terms of whether or not the code of conduct is reasonable and adoptable, I've tried to sum up my advice. So I would say that largely speaking, the conduct element of the code appears reasonable. It does add clarity to when the code applies. I would question, and this is a matter for the committee, whether members are comfortable with that slight extension into the personal life. So that was the part where it said if members, if a reasonable member of the public who knows all of the facts would consider them to be a counsellor or acting as a counsellor when they're doing something in their private life, then they'd be bound by the code of conduct. Just to reiterate, it's not a requirement of the law, but it's a question of whether members are comfortable with that extension in their personal life and whether that's something that you want to see adopted. In my view, the interests element is slightly more problematic. It does go further than the legislation, and I do feel that having those three different types of interests might be slightly more difficult to understand. Members have probably seen I've already got myself confused as I've been going through it, and I've read this and prepared the slides, and the language is so similar, particularly with registrable and non-registrable interests, that I think it potentially causes confusion. I would say that throughout the monitoring officer world, there's been lukewarm reception to certain parts of the code, the interest part being one of them, and that extension into personal life. That's based on anecdotes that I've read and articles that I've read within the professional press. And the concern is that it goes beyond the legal requirements and whether or not that's something that should be adopted. I have suggested some recommendations for members, and I would suggest that you recommend adoption of the conduct element of the model code, subject to altering the gifts and hospitality limit to £25 to reflect the wishes of this committee back in July, unless members have had a change of thought on that. And any alterations in relation to the extension of the code into the private life. I do think we need a further meeting to consider a report on the interest element of the model code and whether or not they should be recommended, what the options might be, how we could perhaps give effect to what the code is trying to achieve without having it written in the way that it's written. And I also thought, Chair, that it would be useful at the next meeting to consider an update on the report from the Committee for Standards in Public Life, the ethical standards in local authorities. We did do a piece of work back in 2019, which seems such a long time ago now. And I think it would be useful to review where we are with some of that. We haven't implemented all of those changes. Part of that is because COVID got in the way. For example, we were about to start recruitment for independent people, but then COVID got in the way of that a little bit. So I think it would be a useful time to reflect on where we're up to, regroup, and decide what actions still need to be carried out, and we can implement those over the next couple of months to make sure that we're starting or soon into the new municipal year we're in a position where we've got all of it completed. We've got a code of conduct that we're happy with, and we're comfortable with the interests as well. So, Chair, that was the end of the presentation. I am just going to, if it's okay with you, see if I can share the model code so members can see what it looks like. So I think I probably need to unshare my screen to then reshare, I think. Have I successfully unshared? Yes, good. So I do have it open here. And I'm just going to share that here, hopefully. Can members see that? Well, I know it might be small, but
Yes.
you can see something on your screen.
Yes.
Yes.
Let me see. I don't know if I can actually make that any bigger. Let me see. Yes, I can. Is that better?
Yes.
Yes.
Oh, hang
So-
on. Yeah, that's better. Yes.
Good. So this is just a joint statement, although I did note it doesn't tell you who the joint statement is from, but it's a joint statement nonetheless. And then it's quite wordy in terms of its introduction and its definitions and the purpose of it. So that's the first couple of pages. Then this is the general principles that are mentioned in the presentation. And then this is the element about when it applies. So it applies when you misuse your position as a councillor and your actions would give the impression to a reasonable member of the public with knowledge of all the facts that you are acting as a councillor. It does go on to add the context around when it applies, what types of communication it applies, and then it moves into the standards. So these are what I've gone through, and then I've summarised these bullet points. But underneath each bullet point, there is some guidance. So what does respect mean? Politeness and courtesy in behaviour, speech and written word. It mentions that debate and having different views are part of a healthy democracy. And it goes on. Some of them have longer guidance. So this one about bullying and harassment, it refers to the ACAS definition of bullying as being offensive, intimidating, malicious or insulting behaviour, an abuse or misuse of power through means that undermine, humiliate, denigrate or injure the recipient, and then how it can occur. But you'll see that this is quite lengthy guidance in terms of that. Then there's just a paragraph. This one, the confidentiality and access to information, you'll see that the requirements, which is the bit in bold, in fact it doesn't cover all of that, is quite lengthy, and I have tried to summarise that in the slide because that is a lot of text for members to, well, not just members of the public, more importantly, to understand and be able to make a complaint about if they felt that there was an issue, and then some guidance. But most of it is one or two bullet points and then a little bit of guidance as to what it means. And then when you get to the end, your interests are set out. You've got the 7 principles in Appendix A, and this is what members will absolutely recognise from our current code of conduct because ours are written under these headings of the 7 principles. And then you've got what you need to do with your interests, the fact that if you don't disclose a pecuniary interest, it's a criminal offence. And then you've got tables setting out what is a pecuniary interest, and then the description of what is a registrable interest. And then this section, the Appendix C, refers to the best practice guidance from the Committee on Standards in Public Life. And these are the ones that this committee looked at back in 2019, and also makes a point that we're still waiting to hear from government in response to this report as to whether there's going to be any legislative changes. and then that just goes down to the 15. And the LGA has said they'll review the code on an annual basis. So, Chair, I'm happy to take questions or hear members' views on what I've just presented. I did want to just bring it to life a bit rather than so I could draw the distinction between what we've currently got and what the new code would mean, and also where it diverges from any of the legislative provisions that we're governed by at the minute.
Thank you, Anthea. Thank you very much for that in-depth presentation. I think we're all better off for having had it as a presentation than to sit and read it. I'm going to take questions as and when they come, and I see Peter Scott, you've got your hands up.
Yes, thank you, Chair. It's about the extension into private life, in a sense. Where does the line, where is it drawn? Because as a councillor, I have, for example, a Facebook page with Councillor Peter Scott. I also have a Twitter page which is Councillor Peter Scott. And I put on there just things that I think are appertaining to the role. Well, I have a private one, which is Peter Scott. And on there, I like to say what I think of anything and anybody. And as long as I'm not violently rude or offensive or swear, I would be concerned that an extension would allow people to silence me in a sense. So the question really is, where does the line draw, and am I allowed a private opinion?
Okay, Chair, are you happy for me to take questions as they
Yeah,
come?
that's
right?
fine. Yeah. Yep.
So I think, first of all, it's really clear that your councillor Facebook page, any social media accounts, absolutely are subject to the Code of Conduct. That is the case now. And so if a complaint came in to me about something you had put on your councillor social media, if it was a justifiable complaint, because there's always that question, then it would be something that I would consider and decide whether or not there was any need to investigate or take it any further. I think it's a really good point that you raised, Councillor Scott, in relation to your private accounts. And the model code doesn't give you more than what I've already given you, which is that it's where your actions would give the impression to a reasonable member of the public who has knowledge of all of the facts that you are acting as a councillor. And I think this is a source of some of the disquiet amongst monitoring officers. I don't think it's necessarily the principle. I think, generally speaking, certainly the sense I got from this committee in July and the sense I get from other monitoring officers is that there will sometimes be times when a member is acting in their private capacity that they would be bound by the Code of Conduct. And I always use the example when I'm doing Code of Conduct training in any event around members, perhaps. I always use, if you're going into a shop and you're returning something and you're having difficulties, and a member might say, do you know who I am? I am councillor whatever. Then that would be an acceptable situation where the Code of Conduct would come into play, because you're using your position to try and get something that you wouldn't otherwise get, potentially. I think it's more difficult when it comes to, as you've described, your personal Facebook account. And there is a risk with the way that the code is written at the moment, and there is a risk. There is a risk that if a member of the public knows you are a councillor, and I have these complaints now where people say, well, it was their personal page, but they're clearly a councillor, and you know they've got a councillor Facebook page as well, and therefore I know they're a councillor, so this should be looked at. And I think on there is a monitoring officer who it's going to be open to interpretation by monitoring officers, and you're relying there on having a monitoring officer and independent person who says, well, actually the Code of Conduct shouldn't apply because it's very clearly a personal account. If you were to say on your personal account, as Councillor Peter Scott, I am saying XYZ, again, the code would bite. It would bite now. I don't think it adds anything, and I think there is a risk, as it's drafted at the minute, that it would open the floodgates for complaints. It would make my life as a monitoring officer very difficult because I'll have lots of complaints to deal with potentially, or respond to, and it then puts me in a difficult position, or any monitoring officer in a difficult position of having to navigate whether or not the code applies in each circumstance. At the moment, it's fairly straightforward. I can't really give you any black and white answer to that because it is very much open to interpretation.
If I could just give an example then, very briefly, if I'm on my own personal page, where I make it clear that they are my personal views and not that as a councillor, if I happen to say I think a decision by the government is an absolute disgrace, have I in any way contravened any rules, or am I not allowed to say that?
No, you are allowed to say that in your personal capacity. Where it might cross the line is if you referenced your position as councillor and then you did something that breached the code, because what you said there is just an expression of a political view. If you added a few expletives into that sentence, and also said you were a councillor, that would bite. The code of conduct would bite, and it would now. I would say, if you're saying, in my role as councillor, I would stand against this expletive policy of the expletive government, that would be, because you're not acting with respect, and you're saying you're a councillor. So even now, that would bite. But on the whole, in your personal capacity right now, if you're saying, I, Peter Scott, think this policy is ridiculous. In fact, if you don't mention your role as councillor, you could add those expletives in if you wanted. That wouldn't be an issue for me to look at.
I understand. Yeah. Thank you very much, Althea. Thank you.
Okay, you happy with that, Peter?
Yes, I am. Thank you.
I've got 2 more hands up as I can see. I'll go on to Jackie next.
Thank you. Well, I was very pleased to see that that element in. We discussed it at some length the last meeting, and I disagree, Peter, totally, because even if you are doing it as a private individual, if you've got any kind of profile at all, and you're likely to have if you've been on, particularly on social media as a councillor, then it's more than likely that people will know you're a councillor. And I'm not saying you can't express political views, of course you can, but if you do it in a manner that is disrespectful in any way, then, well, I mean, what is likely to come back is that you're going to be shouted down by other people on social media, and you wouldn't have any grounds for complaint at all. Personally, I think you should recognise the fact that you are a councillor and you are likely to be recognised as a councillor, and you should behave accordingly at all times. That doesn't mean you can't express political views. Of course you can, but you do it respectfully. The other bit that was about the £25, I think we should stick to that limit. And I wholeheartedly endorse what's come out in this. Quite pleased with it. A little bit complicated on the interest, but I'm sure we can get around that.
Okay, thank you, Jackie. I'll move over to you, Ginny.
Thank you, Chair. It's a question in regards to kind of safeguarding. I'm just wondering, does safeguarding feature within the Code of Conduct, or have any other local authorities kind of added it into their Code of Conduct? And I ask because obviously as corporate parents, we must kind of be held to a high benchmark in relation to kind of our obligation to children and young people. So is its place within the Code of Conduct, or is that located elsewhere?
Yeah, it's not in the Code of Conduct, and I'm not aware of any other authority that has included it. Where it's more likely to appear is in some sort of member development strategy requirement, training, some sort of training requirement. There is a role for the authority as corporate parent. This authority does ask members to undertake corporate parent and training, and we offer that fairly regularly so that members can be aware of their responsibilities, but it's not part of the code of conduct. I think that's probably because there's no legal power to make members undertake training, and therefore including it in something when you can't enforce it makes it an empty requirement, if you like. I think the need to undertake the training to be able to fulfil your corporate parenting responsibilities is a personal responsibility on members, really, to engage in that process, because we would be breaching the law if we required members to undertake the training to be able to fulfil their responsibilities. Does that make sense? I'm not sure if I've explained that very well. It's quite late in the evening. Quite a long day.
Can I just say there that I think safeguarding is an element where if you do ignore something, you're obviously not doing what you should be doing as a counsellor anyway, if you ignore something that should be highlighted. I don't know if that helps, but that would be an expectation, I would think.
Yeah, I think the elements of the code of conduct around being fair, being honest, acting with integrity particularly, would mean that you shouldn't turn a blind eye to anything that you thought was a concern, but it's not express anywhere. I think it's really challenging to have a code that addresses the comprehensive list of things that you would expect of a responsible, upstanding member of an authority, really.
Yeah, I find it surprising that kind of safeguarding and being a corporate parent doesn't feature when obviously it is such a central part of what the council does and what councillors are there to do. So it does seem a bit amiss, I suppose, that it isn't, that the opportunity hasn't been taken to put that within the code of conduct nationally.
Yeah, I agree there, even if it was one liner.
It could be included within the guidance of one of the, we're not wedded, we're not required to be wedded to this. There was a desire for every authority to adopt the same code of conduct so that the same standards applied everywhere. But I've already explained that some authorities have some discomfort around some elements of the draft of the final code of conduct that's being released. So we're not wedded to it. We've already talked about whether or not we want to keep the 50 or reduce it to 25 on gifts and hospitality. So we could, if this committee wanted to recommend to full council, add a line into the guidance at the appropriate point to say you're required to fulfil your safeguarding obligations, or we'd think of better wording than that, but we could include it if we needed to, and then it would be down to full council to decide whether to adopt it. What I would do in that circumstance is include a copy of the code as it stands now and a copy of what we're proposing, if this committee wants to propose something different, and then allow full council to make a decision.
I'll come back to the £25 on that when I've taken everybody's questions, if that's okay. Is that all you wanted, Julia?
Yeah, absolutely. I think if we've got the opportunity to add it in, I'd absolutely be supportive of that. Okay.
Can I go on to Nathan, England?
Thank you, Chair. I'm in support of Gilly's comments there in regards to safeguarding, and also Councillor Seymour's comments, and also the lower amount of the £25. That's all, Chair. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Nathan. Arnold, England?
Yeah, a couple of points. I didn't see any reference to outcomes from complaints, like levels of punishment and who determines, is that hearings of members of the panel. So that's just a general question: is it included or is it elsewhere? And one slightly off the wall: if councillors taking credit for other councillors' work, right? Can that be part? Can that be part of a formal complaint, or is that just politics? Thanks.
In terms of outcomes, I think that's because it's set out in legislation, Councillor England. What we do need to do, and I've already started this, is to review our standards process It hasn't been reviewed for some years. I think it needs a bit of freshening up, and part of that would be around being really clear around the sanctions that are available. There's not many, and one of the recommendations from the Committee for Standards in Public Life was that there needed to be greater powers of sanction. So, for example, there used to be a power in the old law to disqualify members for serious breaches, and not just for small things. That's been removed. There used to be a power to suspend members. That's been removed. So there's certainly recommendations from the Committee for Standards on Public Life to ask for legislative changes to provide some greater powers. I don't think it'll ever get back to disqualification level, but certainly internally we need to review, and it's something this committee can look at. We need to review our process and just be a bit clearer on the information that we provide, both to members of the public who are making a complaint, so that we manage expectations as to what an outcome might be, and also so that members know what the potential consequences would be if they were to breach the code as well.
Okay, you okay with that one, Arnold?
And
Jackie,
then,
did you want to come back in?
Sorry, Chair. There was the second question from Councillor England about taking credit. I think it would be circumstance specific, Councillor England. You do like to challenge me, but arguably it could come under the respect and acting with integrity. But there is, when it comes to political exchanges, there is an element of taking it on the chin because it's political discourse, it's political activity. So I guess it would depend, that it would be circumstance specific, how often, frequency, severity, significance of the claim. You know, that's the sort of things that the monitoring officer and independent person would need to look at.
Okay, yes, it was. There are one or two little issues that just stuck in my mind. We've got in Madeley, one councillor's taking credit for them, saying, you know, since I've told the borough council to do this, they finally acted. Well, you know, I don't like that, but then that's politics and it's harmless, really. So I thought I'd mention it. I thought I'd mention it, and Nathan, as you know, is also a parish councillor and town councillor, and a councillor who's now resigned, so that it's pointless. But he gave misinformation about something, and Nathan put in a complaint because it caused distress to the resident. Is that the sort of thing that should be looked at? And the person was of a different political party to us as well. So could that be seen as mischievous? Sorry, I'll finish there.
I think potentially something like that could fall under the code of conduct. I think it would depend upon whether or not it was deliberate misinformation, whether or not it was reckless or genuine mistake. And again, the potential consequence arising out of it. So potentially, but again, it would be circumstance specific.
Okay, thank you, Arnold. Jackie, I think you wanted to make another comment.
Yes, just a quick question. Is there any indication when this is likely to come into force? And if it does come into force quite soon, will existing councillors be required to sign up to it immediately, or would it wait to the next election?
So this is available to adopt now. So the governance, if you like, to get it to that stage where members are bound by it, would be for this committee to make a recommendation to full council that it should be adopted, or it should be adopted subject to changes. And then once it's adopted by full council, if it's adopted by full council, then all members would be bound to comply with it from the point that it's adopted.
But they wouldn't have to actually sign anything, would they, or would they?
No. Well, they
would have to go through a training course.
Yes, you would need to be retrained in terms of the new requirements. I'm just having a look because there was talk around asking members to sign kind of a pledge, if you like, to do it, but I don't recall seeing it in the new model code. So I'm just checking that now. No, they've obviously steered away from that, presumably as a result of the consultation responses that they've received. Initially, the LGA had talked about having like a shortened version for members to sign upon taking office or upon adoption of the code, but it doesn't look like that's come through to the final version.
I would be quite happy to see us sign up to it straight away then.
I think everybody needs an understanding of it first, isn't it? Is that everything, Jackie? Are you?
Yes, yes.
Yep. Okay. I'm going to go back now to the gift element of it and the £25. I've picked up off a few of you that that's what you would. Can I have a proposer and a seconder for that?
I'll propose it.
Yeah, seconded by Nathan. Everybody in favour of that? Yep.
Yes. Yes.
Okay. Antia, did you want to come back in there?
Yeah, Chair, I just wonder whether or not it's worth having a meeting towards the end of April where I bring it back with the code, with the amendments made, so that all members of this committee are really clear about what's being proposed. And then if we could bottom out the bit about the private life element as well, taking on board, because I think there is a slight difference as to whether or not that's supported or not. And then, Chair, the next meeting I could bring the code back with the amendments highlighted, or the proposed amendments highlighted. I could bring something back around the interest. I'm not hearing too much unhappiness around the proposals about the interest, but I think maybe it could just be worded slightly more clearly.
Yeah.
So I could do some work around that, and then it may be that we can present our code of conduct for adoption to full council, rather than doing it, the conduct element and the interest element. I know that's a slight change to the recommendations, Chair, but I haven't heard what's been said. I just wonder if that might be a better option.
So are you saying that, well, I'll propose that we adopt the conduct elements and then we review the other elements at the end of April?
Well, Chair, I think the gifts and hospitality part is part of the conduct element.
Right.
And the extension into the private life is part of the conduct element.
Right.
So I just wonder if it would be neater to bring it all back with those amendments made, and then we can make one recommendation to full council.
So the amendments will be about the gifts and about the safeguarding element, as Jill has mentioned. Yep. Is everybody happy with that?
Yeah.
Can I propose we meet again on the 28th of April? Wednesday, the 28th of April?
Yes.
Yes. Yeah, that's
Yeah?
fine.
Yeah.
And it gives us all a chance to digest what we've gone through tonight.
Can I just ask a quick question? Sorry, I got my hand up.
Yeah, sorry.
I'm thinking of, I think I know the answer, but I'm thinking of councillors that are charged with committing an offence, like drink driving or whatever, but something like that, trespass, even demonstrating. Yeah. Does that count in any way within these procedures, or is it outside of it? No.
No.
That's a fine. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's a fair point, but there are far more serious offences that legally you're not allowed to take any action for in terms of members. So other offences, other lesser offences, wouldn't be bound by it. That doesn't mean that parties might not take, political groups might not take their own disciplinary action, if you like, for want of a better word, but certainly from a council perspective, it's not an arena that we would get into. I wouldn't get into that space.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you, Arnold. Is there anything anybody else wanted to add at this point? No?
No.
Okay, well, I'll suggest that we have our next meeting on the 28th of April. and it gives us a chance to review everything then. And thank you very much, Anthea. It's probably a nightmare going through all this for you.
No, not at all. I know it's quite a dry subject, Chair, but I quite enjoy it.
Oh, right.
You're going to send it out, are you?
I will, yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Chair,
Is there anything else?
can I
Sorry?
just ask if members are happy just to use the links within the slides, or do they want me to send the code separately as well? The link should just click straight through.
That's
Yeah.
fine.
I think I'd like to see the whole thing.
You-
I mean, I don't know how many pages that is, but perhaps it could be sent out to members.
The link will give you the whole thing.
Yeah.
So within the slides is the hyperlink, and if you click on that, it will take you through to
that part.
to
Yeah.
the full code. You'll have it all by doing that.
Right.
If you have any issues, Jackie, I'm sure Anthea,
Absolutely.
if you email, she'll
Should be
take that
okay.
on. Yep.
I just find it more difficult to read on screen than having a hard copy in front of me. But I can do it. Yeah.
I can ask
Like I
somebody
say,
to-
if you have any issues, contact Jane or Anthea. Yep. Okay, thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank
Thank
you.
Chair.
Okay, good night.
Right.
Good night.
Good night.